So I don't think Michael needs much introduction, as I'm sure you all know. He's a developmental psychologist at Stanford. Sorry, I should have said I'm chairing this because Julian is ill. Forgot to say. And his lab at Stanford is the Stanford Language and Cognition Lab. He's very well known for initiating studies such as Wordbank and the Mainly Babies Consortium, which seek to pool and systematize the work of researchers. And that's really pretty important because it reduces parallel efforts and puts them together. And it also provides some kind of check for replication, which is also, I think, very important in this age of multiple than open science. He did his undergraduate degree at Stanford and then his PhD at MIT. He is very committed to open science, as you'll see if you look at his CV, because he has quite a large number of publications on the top of it, which are pending, subject to data collection, which is a very nice sign that these things are pre-registered and the data collection presumably is ongoing. His research is mainly with infants and young children, and it focuses on social learning and the integration of information sources. And I would say the multiple sources of information available to children in their learning of language. And he has an emphasis on attempting to model this with Bayesian modeling. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, which will probably incorporate at least some of all of that, if not all of it. So it's over to you now, Michael.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's exciting to see so many familiar names in the audience, folks whose research that we've engaged with and built on over the years. So it's really wonderful to be here. So today, as Elena said, I'm going to be sharing some of my work on using larger data sets to look at children's language learning at scale. So I'm certain that I don't have to convince this audience that language learning is one of the key puzzles of cognitive science. Just this incredible transformation continues to fascinate me as a person, as a parent, and as a scientist, how we go in a couple of short years from speechless, wordless infants to toddlers who are incredibly effective at communicating and using language to make their way through the world, even as their knowledge of language continues to grow. Language explodes on the scene. This is my daughter, Madeline, at 18 months. Elena told me the last time she saw me in person was right after Madeline had been born. She's now 9. So at 18 months, she had never combined words. She said happy bee, which meant happy birthday, but I think that was kind of a frozen large phrase. But at 19 months, we got composition for the first time. She said blue ball. And I was a very proud psycholinguist dad. At 23 months, she was already saying things like spike doggy, no food, eat dirt. That's my mother-in-law's dog, Spike, who doesn't eat food, he eats dirt. And by 26 months, here she is. She's a teenager. She says, Dada, move own body. Might need a little bit more space. And this is basically how she talks to me now. But of course, you all know this, the physical transformation between 18 and 26 months is not that impressive. She's a little bit heavier, a little bit better on her feet, got a little bit more dirt on her face. But in terms of expressive capacity, there's just a huge transformation. So characterizing this growth in expressive capacity, the learning and the generalizations that fuel it is the goal of my and really of our shared research. So understanding this process is going to require quantitative theories of learning and how that learning operates over children's perceptual input and within their cognitive limitations. And in much of my previous work, I started my career trying to develop probabilistic models in the Bayesian tradition that instantiated this kind of quantitative theory. So my first published work was about linking words and their reference in the attempt to generalize meanings through cross-situational exposure. And I think by many accounts, this literature was a pretty big success. My model was only one of a number in this literature using different formalisms from machine learning, neural networks, so forth. And they all captured the same basic set of phenomena. Children were able to make these mappings by a certain age. These networks or models could, quote, do mutual exclusivity and so forth. So treating these quantitative models as scientific artifacts, we could ask about how well they represented our scientific hypotheses about learning. And also critically, how well those hypotheses were being evaluated and compared to data. And from that perspective, the literature didn't look so good to me as I started to try to scale these models up, as I tried to enhance them and build on them in my first work when I got to Stanford. Because the input that I had been using was just a few hours of annotated video. So hand annotations on a couple of hours of data. Some of the other studies had gotten more data, but only by virtue of creating it artificially. And the evaluation that we were doing was essentially on a handful of binary experimental results. Children do mutual exclusivity at 18 months or 24 months, p less than 0.05 with a small sample of children from a particular population. So although I was really excited about these scientific hypotheses about learning that were embodied in these models, I came to the conclusion that we needed more data to build theories that could predict and explain, and to allow us to compare between theories, select those whose assumptions fit the data better, and discard those that didn't. And this seemed like a shame because at the same time, everybody was talking a lot about language acquisition and its importance for policy, and they all had the same more or less theory in mind, I think. Roughly that children were hearing both child-directed and overheard speech in their environment, that this accumulated. There were a variety of very influential accumulator models coming out around this time through some process of language processing in the moment. And that resulted in a set of learning outcomes, including comprehension and production. So our goal was really to formalize this theory and put it in contact with data, to create a unifying formal framework for thinking about that accumulation of early language. So can we formalize this and can we put it in contact with data? Well, what data would we need? It turns out during the same time period when I've been thinking about this, another subfield has been thinking about the importance of data. So as we've found out in the past few years, AI, artificial intelligence, grows in leaps and bounds when the appropriate data are available. The availability of large resources like web crawls for language models or ImageNet, a database of images for computer vision models, means that AI has just moved incredibly quickly in the past 10 years. These modern predictive models are incredibly data intensive. So each dot on the screen here represents 50 million words. The gray dots are the 500 billion words that GPT-3, which is a state-of-the-art language model minus a couple of years, was trained on. And the red half dot here is an average 2-year-old's language input. So there's 50 million words. And the data disconnect here is just completely striking. There's 20,000 times less data required for the 2-year-old than for the language model. So what I've been thinking about, kind of comparing the situation in child language and the situation in AI, is whether we can evaluate learning models on children's learning inputs and outcomes, and what data we might use to do that evaluation and what we might learn along the way. So let me try to share a little bit of that process with you.
Just hang on a minute, Michael. There's some horrible background noise going on. Has everybody got their mics off? Okay, let's try again.
No problem. Okay, so this talk is about some of the initial results as I've followed that set of intuitions and with my collaborators tried to think about evaluating learning models on children's learning inputs and outcomes. The way we've pursued this research project is by building resources. And this idea of a general shared model of language learning as accumulation has really fueled the creation of resources and the organization of those resources around this basic model. So the idea is to create resources that correspond to theoretically important entities in such a model. To capture language input, we have SayCam, corpora of head-mounted video, and ChildisDB, some tools that build on the wonderful child language data exchange system, Brian McWhinney and collaborators. To capture language processing, we have the Peekbank database. And then to capture outcomes, we have Wordbank. It won't be the theme of this talk, but I want to note that these are fundamentally open science projects. Open science is a key approach that enables faster research progress. we're able to pool effort across the entire language acquisition community to get all the data together, to share them out openly, and to accelerate the work of each individual team that's working on these questions. So often open science is presented as a set of sticks, that is penalties. Okay, you've got to fill out this form, you've got to do this thing or your science will be incorrect. And it's important to have basic standards around things like data sharing, openness, pre-registration, and so forth. But my take on this culture shift issue is that open science is not just sticks, it's also carrots. There are incredibly exciting things that can happen when we share data together, when we collaborate together, when we make resources together. We create an open ecosystem that accelerates discovery in ways that other fields have seen and that we're just beginning to see. And I hope that by aggregating data in the way we're doing, we create resources that allow us to learn as a community much more about the developing mind. So these resources will form the outline for my talk. We'll arrange them into a predictive framework for fitting models, with the idea being that we capture input and we push those through hypotheses about learning mechanisms, and then we evaluate those hypotheses using these outcome measures. So I'll first describe the resources and then talk a bit about predictive models. Let's start with input resources. I actually won't talk much about ChildisDB. ChildisDB is an effort to systematize and make reproducible work from the Child Language Data Exchange system. I think nearly everyone here is probably familiar with that. I just want to acknowledge the debt of my work in the field in general to the incredible work that's represented by Childis. Before big data was a thing, before open science was a thing, Childis was a model for how all of the data in a subfield could be shared out with the broader community. That could be open, it could be part of an open infrastructure of tools that students learned about, that students aspired to contribute to. And I think that's just an amazing model. It's really set our field on the right course, and just want to acknowledge how important that's been. So that said, I want to talk a little bit about one resource that we've been working on that goes a bit beyond the transcripts and third-person videos in Childis, and that's the SACAM dataset. So folks like Linda Smith and Karen Adolph and others have pioneered the use of egocentric video. This is a wonderful method that allows you to learn about children's experience in the context of learning, context in which they're experiencing language. So SACAM is a dense, openly available data set, which contains data from 3 children of developmental psychologists who recorded. You'll see why this is important, because they recorded 2 hours a week from age of 6 to 30 months for their child. This yielded 400 hours of egocentric video, which is all available on Databrary, a video sharing data set that Karen Adolph, Rick Gilmore, and their collaborators have wonderfully created. And SACAM includes annotations of context, some speech transcriptions, a variety of valuable metadata about the kids. So if you look at the videos from SACAM, I won't play the audio here because it's kind of noisy, but if you look at the videos, you see many of the insights that Adolph Smith and others have discussed about this kind of egocentric perspective on the world, right? You see that the child is moving through a world in which objects impinge much more closely on their visual field because their arms are shorter, they're much closer to the ground, hands come in and provide demonstrations. Things are a little bit more chaotic than the more static adult view. But what we found exciting about the SACAM dataset is the longitudinal depth and the amount of video made it possible to use this as inputs to artificial intelligence systems, which can really simulate learning from this kind of video and give us insights into the developing visual system. Just to show you one example of this and how this kind of corpus can be used in AI. This is a project by Chung-Shu Shuang and Dan Yeamans. They've been developing unsupervised models for visual representation learning. These models learn what are called contrastive embeddings, which are representations that are optimized to maximize the similarity of related images and minimizing the similarity of distinct images. And in a recent paper, a group of us led by Chung-Shu used SACAM to train a variant of these algorithms that was optimized for video. So he ran these algorithms through the SACAM corpus and compared them with a variety of different other algorithms. And the metric that he used was actually the correlation between these and neural signals. So there's an evaluation with respect to how close the learned representations are to specific neural signals. And what you find is that when you train these unsupervised models shown here in red on SACAM, despite the relatively smaller size of this data set compared with the really big data sets that AI folks normally use, you actually get pretty good neurally predictive representations being learned out. So this result is kind of a nice example of the general idea that if we use human-sized data sets, we can get a better sense of how human learning uses the data. This is though kind of a glass half empty, glass half full finding, because although we did pretty well with SACAM here, so that's these two bars, you do better with the bigger data set, and actually you do better with the bigger data set than even with the supervised baseline. That's the black bar here. So okay, that's the glass half empty. With more data, you still do better with the unnatural data, the non-egocentric data. So after this paper was finished, Changshu came and Dan came to us and said, hey, the problem with SACAM is that it's just not big enough. So what we've been trying to do in the next, and what we're planning on doing in the next couple of years is to expand this data set by about tenfold. So we're in the process of constructing a new data set called BabyView, which uses a brand new re-engineered camera to get a much higher resolution, larger field of view videos from the egocentric perspective. So here's an example of one of these videos.
I know.
So you can see now we're seeing much more of what the child sees. The resolution is much higher. The angle is a landscape rather than a portrait, which allows us to see both the face of the caregiver and the hands of the child as they interact with objects, which is a very cool resource. So this data set also has a bunch of new sensor information, gyroscopes and accelerometers. It's kind of a baby GoPro rig, basically. So we're very excited about this data set. We're currently piloting a new iteration of the camera right now, and we're hopeful that we're going to be able to release a larger data set in the next couple of years.
Yeah, what do you think?
Okay. So moving onward, I told you a little bit about some of the resources that we've created to think about children's input. Let's think about their learning outcomes. So the first of these projects I want to tell you about is the Peekbank resource. So many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the looking while listening paradigm developed by Anne Fernald and her collaborators to measure children's language processing in early childhood and infancy. So you show a picture of a cookie and a book and you say, look at the book. The child moves their gaze back and forth and settles on the book. If that's the matching word. And across many, many different studies with diverse populations, you find this very consistent set of patterns. These are the data from one paper, actually, with adults and children learning American Sign Language. So you see the proportion of looking to target plotted on the Y. On the X is time synchronized to the onset of the target sign, which is here ball. Adults quickly and reliably go to the ball in this case, the target. Older children get there a little bit slower and with a lower asymptote, and even younger children are above chance, but are even slower. And the Fernald Lab and their collaborators and now many other groups around the world have shown parallel results in studies with very diverse populations, including in the US and elsewhere. You see socioeconomic status effects here, but you see this kind of word recognition process in late talkers, children born premature, bilinguals, and so forth. And accuracy is almost always an increasing function with age. It's correlated with vocabulary, even controlling for age. Reaction time gets faster with age, and reaction time is also linked to the growth of vocabulary in these studies. So because this paradigm has become such a popular experimental paradigm for measuring children's early language, there's an opportunity, which is to take the data sets from the different groups around the world using this task and aggregate them together. And that's precisely what we've been trying to do. So a number of years ago, my collaborators and I created Peekbank, which is a flexible, reproducible interface to these developmental eye tracking data sets. Peekbank has a number of different components. There's a website, but there's also a backend database that contains the data from all of the different studies that are included, now up to about 25 different studies using looking while listening. And it also contains a set of tools for rationalizing these data that come from different eye trackers or different methods, different studies, different kinds of stimuli, different ages of children, different experimental designs, and so forth. So this has been a very infrastructure heavy project, and it was just published this year in Behavior Research Methods, led by Martin Zetterston. This was a really fun collaborative project that started in person but continued during the pandemic with a series of hackathons with folks all over the country and all over the world contributing. And as a part of this process, we created this really, I think, robust and useful paradigm for processing eye tracking data, where we've got a data import R package that allows us to rationalize and check all of the data, push them into the same format, then a common format and schema for our database, and then a set of access packages, one called Peekbank, which allows you to pull data out for analysis, and then a set of visualization packages so you can actually look at the data in real time on our website. I encourage you to go explore that if you're interested. Just to give you a quick sense of what you see in this data set, this is 15 of the data sets from Peekbank. So this is 15 different studies, all imported into the database. Again, proportion looking is on the vertical and time is on the horizontal. The 0 point is always the onset of the target word, and you can see average word recognition curves for each study in black, with differences in the precise shape, but always that general rise after 0. And the individual items in the data sets are plotted as colors here. So you can see a little bit of the diversity and variability. Some of these data sets have tremendous numbers of items, others have just a small number with many participants per. And so we're currently in the process of analyzing these data and trying to really understand the nature of word recognition, how it changes developmentally, and how it varies across items. Okay, the last resource that I want to tell you about is a resource that uses a standardized instrument in early language, which again, many of you have worked on. Some of you have even worked on the important adaptation project, the UK CDI, which came out of your group. So many of you know very much about this instrument, but just to introduce it, these are the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories, or CDIs for short. CDIs are a family of short form, parent report forms for measuring early vocabulary, originally developed by Liz Bates, Larry Fenson, and their collaborators. These are essentially just bubble sheets with lots and lots of words, as well as grammatical items, communication items, and other types of items. And to some people's surprise, these are quite reliable and valid instruments for measuring early language. They're far from perfect, but their reliability is pretty good, test, retest, and their validity, their relationship to other language measures, is quite surprisingly good. That's because parents are, by and large, experts on their children, and so often they can report on a variety of behaviors that might not be visible in a single visit to the lab. In addition, CDIs are very inexpensive to administer. They can be administered online or by mail or by an interview, and can be used for clinical screening. As a result, they've been adapted for more than 100 languages around the world. Some of those languages, including the UK CDI team's adaptation, have very large normative data sets, which makes them a very valuable resource in terms of data, because they can be used to create percentile norms. And that, again, created an opportunity. This is actually the first data aggregation project that we engaged in. We saw that there was an opportunity where all these groups around the world were collecting data with largely the same structure. And we thought we could put these together into a single ecosystem that would allow us to explore and make public this larger data set on children's variability and consistency across languages. So with that in mind, in 2015, we started the Wordbank project. Wordbank is a database of CDIs from around the world. And when we started out, we got a bunch of these normative data sets, and we started creating this, what we called the snail, that showed all the different languages in Wordbank. By 2019, we'd grown substantially. We're up to 29 languages, had gotten a bunch of really big normative data sets. And we actually just released this summer an update and revision of Wordbank that has now up to 40 languages. with a variety of longitudinal data, disorders data, bilingual data, and so forth. So we're really hoping to make Wordbank a resource that's useful for folks studying language learning in the early years across a variety of different sources of variability in children's learning. So Wordbank allows both the programmatic access to data. So if you're analyzing data in R, you can use our R package Wordbanker to pull in the data. But it also allows interactive exploration of CDI data, which can be fun and useful both for researchers and for teaching. Just to give you a sense of this, here is a demonstration of one of our apps. So you can pick through the different languages here. So perhaps we choose German, which shows this is productive vocabulary by age, our kind of classic plot. You can split this up by demographics, whatever demographic information we have available. So you might look at the median difference between females and males, and you get this very robust female advantage. You can check whether that's true in other languages. This is Korean, and you see that same female advantage. Check in another language, say maybe Swedish, same thing, different overall pattern of data, but same general advantage. So these interactive exploration tools allow researchers to create hypotheses, check hypotheses, poke around in the data. And we actually had so much fun poking around in these data that we ended up writing a book that systematized our explorations of the different ways of looking at these data, from item variation to child level variation, category level variation, both semantic and syntactic, and so forth. This book is called Variability and Consistency in Early Language Learning, the Wordbank Project. I encourage you to check it out. It's free online. We hope you explore it and use it, find it useful as a reference for grounding your analyses of all sorts of different aspects of child language in whatever the extant data are on variability across languages. So one of the nice things here is we were able to systematize analyses that many others, including some on this call, had done on child language and apply those systematically across the languages that we had data for. So now if you're interested in something like, say, the noun bias, you can look up the magnitude of noun bias across the different languages and samples that we have access to and use that as a baseline for your investigation. Just as a teaser for this book, in the hopes that I can get you interested and maybe surprise you with some of these and make you look at it, I'll give you 3 cross-linguistic generalizations, which are our take-homes from the book. The first is that the language system is tightly woven. So following the insights of Liz Bates and others, we look at the relationships between the growth of the lexicon and the growth of grammar, lexicon and morphology, the growth of communicative gesture and vocabulary growth. And in each case, we find that the correlations between these are very, very high between individuals. And I think this is a fascinating finding, and it converges with evidence from brain data, evidence from AI, and so forth. This is a whole nother talk probably, but the organization of the linguistics department that I grew up with, where we've got this beautiful hierarchical organization of phonetics, phonology, morphology, the lexicon, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, that hierarchical organization does not predict either the neural organization of language nor the locus of variation across kids. And I think that's really fascinating and upsets a lot of theoretical models that I was trained in and that are prominent in the field. So that tight weave of variation in language is maybe more consistent with some of the theoretical viewpoints that have been developed around lucid. But I think it's an exciting convergence of data from a bunch of different sources, from acquisition, from now neuroscience, and from new language models that learn all aspects of language together rather than one at a time. The second generalization that we made here is that children's similar interests drive their communication. Across languages, we find a lot of similarity in which words get learned early. Words for social routines, words for people, and words for small objects. So there's a surprising consistency in children's early vocabulary, and there's surprising consistency in which categories are over and underrepresented in children's early language. We think this is fundamentally interesting and suggests some of the conceptual bases of language learning. Finally, children do take different routes into language They vary first and foremost in the speed of learning, and their variability is really considerable, but they also vary in whether they tend to learn more nouns first, or whether they tend to combine words and have a relatively smaller noun vocabulary. This secondary variation is pretty interesting and may provide clues for the mechanisms of language learning. Okay, so that's hopefully a teaser. Hopefully you're thinking, wait, I don't agree with that, or I'm not sure, I don't know. So please do check out the book. I'd be very happy to also to expand on any of these in the question period. All right, so now let me move to the idea of using these data resources that we've created as ways of thinking about hypotheses about learning mechanisms and model comparison, which is where I started, right? I started by saying I didn't have enough data to actually compare between models of learning. And now we've tried to create some data resources so we at least have some of the tools for making these comparisons. And this is very much ongoing work. You'll see that there are a number of projects that push this agenda forward, but there's plenty more to do. All right, so when I say we're going to create predictive models, you might think about this naive strategy for predicting children's learning, where we've got our model on the x-axis and children's vocabulary size on the y-axis, and each of these dots is an individual child. And maybe this is cool because we actually have a lot of dots, from a lot of children, and we do some good job predicting this pattern of data. And this is a very useful strategy, and we and many others have pursued it in other contexts. But I actually think there are two fundamental problems with this strategy from the perspective of building cognitive models. The first is that age predicts most of the variance in language learning. It's a very good predictor. And much of the other variance comes from things that are very difficult to measure at scale, the home environment and genetics. And we can measure these, we do measure them, but measuring them at scale where we also have good developmental characterization, it's not that easy, and we actually don't have those data for the kids in our samples in Wordbank. So instead, I'm going to follow this very inspiring, wonderful paper that can continue to shape a lot of my work by Goodman, Dale, and Lee, and do a little bit of data judo. The alternative strategy is to predict word difficulty, not kid vocabulary. So here we have the child's age on the x-axis and the probability of knowing a word on the y-axis. And what we have here is dog, and maybe give is a little bit harder, and tomorrow is a little bit harder than that. And this alternative strategy gets around the confounds of variation between kids, where we have a lot of unobserved variables that make a really big difference. Words, there are a lot of things that make words vary, but we can actually theorize those, make hypotheses, and compare them. So this gets around the confounds and hopefully helps us understand mechanisms. So we can say things like, well, maybe dog is learned early because it's more frequent, or maybe it's because it's more concrete. Maybe give is learned a little later because it requires sentence structure. You need to really know what's being given and to whom in order to figure out the meaning of give. Maybe tomorrow is said later because it's conceptually challenging and time is hard to think about. Or maybe it's learned later just because it's long and hard to say. So this word-by-word prediction strategy has been one that has been kind of thought-provoking and productive for me, and I'd like to share a little bit of our work using it to try to compare models. So actually the first time I worked with this strategy was working with a different data set where we couldn't predict child-by-child variation because we had exactly one child. So that's the Human Speechome project of Deb Roy. This project yielded raw data of about 36 months of video from Deb's house, 2 terabytes. Brandon Roy, the first author of this project, who's not related to Deb, actually spent his entire PhD managing the transcription effort for this, which yielded about 9 million words of transcribed speech. So I'll just show you the day in the life from this data set. So the lights come on in each of the rooms of the house, privacy shutters, getting ready, the child's playing, and then the child's going to have a nap. Folks are going to come back in the evening, get ready, and have some dinner, read stories, put the child down, and then everybody else goes to bed. So you get this massive multimodal data set, and Deb Roy created this as a way of thinking about learning input for machines as well as for kids. So I think this is a very prescient project in many ways. And it allows you to think about variation, not between kids, but between words. So just as a side note here, I think this is a wonderful project. It was also designed from the outset not to be an open data set, and that has really limited its application. So there are only a couple of papers published using this data set. And that's fundamentally a shame because it's a rich and exciting data set, but it was the way that Deb and his family decided to navigate the privacy concerns here. Because of this experience, really a lot of what I do is think about at the design stage how I can navigate those privacy concerns with families so that we can create data sets that continue to be useful for the community while also preserving privacy where possible for the families. And so making sure that we navigate that sensibly is one way that we need to think in the future in order to create data sets that enable further progress. So here's the predictive approach that we took. So each data point here is going to be a word, and what we're going to try to do is predict when the child first produced that word. And the predictive model is just a very simple regression model, but we can add in a variety of different predictors that tell us things that are useful about the specific information sources involved. So for example, the frequency of the word in the child's input prior to production, the number of phonemes in the word to see how hard it is to say, the length of the utterances in which the word occurs, a bunch of psycholinguistic predictors around concreteness, imageability, and familiarity, and then some multimodal predictors that looked at the distribution of where the word was said in space and in time and in language. And you can see that each of these predictors contributes unique variance. Frequency, number of phonemes, mean utterance length is good. The psycholinguistic ones do a little bit, not a ton. And then spatial distinctiveness here actually did a really large amount. So you can see we're not perfect by any means in our predictions. We can't tell why the child said fish very early. It turns out it's because there were these really kind of colorful fish stickers on his wall. We don't really have a good account for why the child said but very late. Maybe it's a conjunction, it's hard to say, and so forth. But we do get some predictive traction. We can quantify that, and we can compare the predictive traction afforded by each of these different predictors. So this felt like a real advance because we could put many different information sources into a model and compare their magnitudes. And that was very different than what felt like the bag of tricks approach that you sometimes see in word learning and early language, where we document the existence of a particular information source, but we never compare it to another one in terms of its effects on the actual overall learning picture. Okay, unfortunately, there weren't a lot of other data sets on offer like Deb's, so we were limited in our ability to apply this strategy. But we decided to generalize it in a different way. Following Goodman, Dale, and Lee, we used the Wordbank data as our outcome. So here's the study by Mika Brzezinski. They got the acquisition curves for words across 10 different languages, and this required creating translation equivalents across languages, which are now in Wordbank. They're called unilemmas. This is a very difficult task on its own. You have to check them with linguists. There are compromises and policies to be made. So if you're interested in conceptual equivalents across languages, this might be a fun resource for you to look at, because Wordbank now has many, many, many unilemmas which have been hand-checked and curated and so forth. As an example, if you want to know about kind of pronoun acquisition across languages, reach out. I'd love to talk to you about how we coded this and how we've looked at the structured pronouns across languages. But we did this for all the words, and so here you can see the trajectories for dog and for jump across these 10 languages. And our goal is to predict this outcome. Why is dog early for English? Is it because dog is very highly frequent in English, speech to English kids? Is it because it's short and easy to say? What causes it to be earlier than jump for English speakers, but maybe not as much so for Swedish speakers? So what we're creating then is a schema where we take input predictors from Childis and ChildisDB, and these are going to be from different kids. This is average input for somebody learning English. And that's predicting now average outcomes for the kids in the Wordbank data set. So we're really trying to capture something about the general trajectory of learning different words within each language. And the learning model here, again, is going to be very simple. It's just a regression model. So the regression model in the middle is going to tell us how different input predictors relate to outcomes, how much traction we can get. And the output of this kind of model is going to be a set of regression coefficients for these different predictors. So the predictors here are on the vertical, and on the horizontal is the standardized strength of the predictors. Each dot is a language. The solid line is the average across languages. So big things to notice: frequency and concreteness are very important. They're especially important, I'm not showing this here, but it's true, especially important for nouns. For verbs, the mean length of the utterances in which the words occur is most important. And then some other predictors that people have been excited about, valence and arousal, didn't perform well in our sample. Didn't seem like they caught a lot of extra variance. So it didn't seem like those kind of affective or emotional predictors were overall predictors of the structure of the lexicon. So one thing that you can do when you have data like this, you can say, how similar are languages to one another in the predictors that matter? So going into this project, we thought, well, we don't have that much linguistic diversity here, but we have some. And you might imagine that a language like Turkish, which is morphologically complex, might have different predictors that matter. You might imagine that there would be some variation here. But it turns out that the correlation between predictors across the languages is quite high, and it's much higher than a random baseline. So in this first study, what we concluded was across 10 languages, the same information sources appeared to matter for learners to approximately the same degree. And this was true whether we looked within all of the words or within individual categories like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so forth. So this kind of striking level of consistency led us to think about what other predictors we could put in that were more model-based, that were more sophisticated from a learning perspective. In one study that looked at this, we used some of the work of Linda Smith and Thomas Hills and their collaborators to look at lexical networks. So in the child's developing lexicon, there, you can get an average set of words that might be available to the child, either in production or in comprehension. And then Hills and Smith and their colleagues noted that you could create semantic networks from these words. In our work, we used semantic structure measures from word embeddings. These are AI models that use large corpora, in our case, child-directed corpora, to get the approximate similarity of words to one another. And you can use these to get a nice picture of what's connected to what. So for a very young child, like a 12-month-old, there's not that much, but as the lexicon gets bigger, you start to see islands emerge, like animals, or here you get a bunch of body parts, animals, so forth. By the time you've got the 24-month average lexicon, there's a lot of words, and you've got these big clusters of body parts and foods and so forth. So one thing that folks have done here is to look at the predictive relationship between the network structure and what children learn. And Abdullah's work generalized this across the same set of 10 languages and showed that the network geometry actually predicted age of acquisition over and above that previous model. So you could really get some interesting leverage on which words were learned earlier, which words were learned later, by seeing which words were most important in the semantic network. And there's a fun finding that the phonological network showed the same organization as well, sort of mirroring some early network structure type analyses from Luce and others. Okay. The last finding I want to tell you about is a study in which we used a neural network model to try and get leverage on a bit more of the linguistic structure that influences acquisition. So one question was always whether the structure of the sentences in which a word is used makes a difference to learning. Some words tend to be used in longer, harder sentences. Others tend to be used in easier sentences or even on their own. And up till now, we had only used very, very simple models of sentence structure, really essentially the length of the utterance as our predictor. Here in this study, Eva Portalance, a PhD student in my lab, used new neural network language models. These are now out of date compared to some of the really fancy ones, but they can be trained on childless data, which is good. So we used a long short-term memory model, an LSTM, trained on childless data. And then what we did was we extracted the predictability or surprisal from this model for each word And so the average surprisal of a word tells you how predictable it tends to be in various contexts. And we use that to capture which sentences are are easy or hard, and then which words on average occur in easy or hard contexts. When we plug this into our models as a whole, we found that it didn't improve the model that much. But there was an exception. It really improved the model for function words and predicates, and it didn't at all for nouns. So syntactic predictability really helped us distinguish which words were easy when they were function words and which words were hard. For example, you was very poorly predicted in our baseline models, but we gained a huge amount of predictive traction, that's the size of this bar, by adding the predictability in context, which is high. So you is quite predictable, and so that it's actually learned much earlier than you would expect just from kind of other aspects of the word. So this is the ordering of kind of gain and model predictability. You can see the top 5 or top 6 are all function words, then below that predicates and so forth. And there's only one noun that occurs in the top list at all. So the syntactic predictability really, or string predictability really made a big difference for certain types of words. And Eva now in her dissertation work has actually extended this finding across a number of different languages. I think German, Mandarin, French, Spanish, and English, all of the languages for which we had enough childless data to be able to train these sorts of models. So by capturing syntactic predictability, language models help to predict when function words and verbs are learned, kind of reinforcing an insight that's been out there for a long time in smaller scale studies of language learning, which is that different kinds of words seem to be learned in different ways. Different information sources matter. For nouns, the concrete nouns are learned earlier and easier, and hearing nouns again and again, perhaps because of some kind of cross-situational mechanism, appears to help them get acquired. In contrast, frequency matters less for verbs. What matters more for verbs and other predicate words is occurring in consistent contexts. Okay, so moving towards wrapping up, what I've argued here is that building theories of child language is going to require better data resources, and we need to use an open science approach to pool our efforts and to pool our data following the kind of important precedents set by resources like Childless. The resources that we make not only are helpful for descriptive insights about development, they can also interface with new unsupervised models in AI, and I'm very excited about the possibility of harnessing the AI juggernaut that is continuing to change our lives in many different ways, and attaching that to some of the important learning questions in early language acquisition that we all care about from a scientific perspective. Finally, I hope you see some examples in this work of how connecting resources to create models of early language can lead to a bit of progress on both prediction and explanation, and hopefully as prerequisites to theory building. Okay, thanks very much, and encourage you to explore some of these resources that I shared today.
Thanks very much, Michael, for a fascinating talk. Yes, everybody's clapping on their little screens. So either, if you want to raise a question, you can either put your hands up, I mean your electronic hands, or you can put your hands up, but we might miss you, or alternatively put something in the chat. Who wants to start off? Let me just have a look if I can see everybody.
Javier asks, this is more just a clarification. I didn't get what's the criterion to decide that a word has been learned. Is it appearing for the first time in the corpus? Yeah, so I elided this detail because in different studies, we used a different criterion. So in the De Broglie data, we predicted the age of very first production in the corpus. And that meant we actually went through and checked, okay, this is the first instance of this word, and we had to make sure, okay, it really was produced by the child and so forth. In contrast, in Mika's study, we actually predicted through logistic regression the entire logistic curve, its slope and its intercept. So we were predicting every single data point on that curve, rather than just an individual point of emergence. That felt, from a data analytic standpoint, like it was a very virtuous thing to do, but it was computationally intensive and limited the models that we could use. And so in subsequent studies like Eva's, we actually went back to using the 50% point at which those curves cross 50%. And with a little bit more psychometric acumen, we realized that actually, if we believe that the logistic curve type is a reasonable approximation, and it appears to be from the data, then really what we're predicting is just the intercept and not the slope of that curve. And that's kind of okay with us, because a lot of the slope may have to do with kind of other irrelevant factors. So we're really predicting difficulty in an item response theoretic sense, and that's not a bad thing to do.
Right, anybody else? Okay, well, while you're thinking, as I can't, Michael, could you possibly take your screen off so that I can see more of the, yeah, that's better. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for people, there's one little thing I wanted to ask you, which I think might be interesting to reflect on. We've done both behavioral and modeling studies where we look at, in the modeling, it's just a question of what the model learns first. And this, I'm simply referring to I versus you. So in our behavioral and in our modeling studies, well, now in the behavioral studies, kids learn structures with I before you. And in the modeling studies, because of frequency, the models learn you before I. And we've explained that in terms of pragmatics. Children are more interested in talking about themselves, and parents are more interested in talking about children. So I was interested in the quick glance I took at your at some of the stuff you presented at the end, where it looked like you was predicted much more highly than I wasn't sure I could see I. There was a little sub-I somewhere halfway down. I wondered if you'd like to comment on basically behavioral measures where a model is learning on the basis of basically frequency in the input, and then your predictive measures.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I kind of alluded to, one of our goals is to go back, now that we've coded equivalents for pronouns across all of the languages, and look at the pattern of pronoun acquisition and sort of do this predictive modeling more specifically focused on pronouns. Mm-hmm. Your explanation sounds very plausible to me. I would have to look at the eventual, the actual predictions for those individual items from this model. What the model did show there was that the predictions got better for you, especially when we added the syntactic contexts. I don't know whether that fixed the issue you described or just decreased the distance between the two. I'm not sure. I would have to look at the data in a different way to understand that. But it's a very interesting question. I think your question also highlights a real important caveat to these analyses, which is that especially for semantically richer words, we are measuring that the child uses them, not that the child uses them in an adult-like way. And so there are real gaps. I mean, we see children, for example, using this word tomorrow, and it is learned late by CDI standards, but we know that the kids don't know what that means for the most part at that time, based on experimental studies. So the kids are using a variety of time words, color words, the words for logical words in ways that may be incompletely adult-like, or that have a kind of a distinct or different semantics, maybe overgeneralized, so forth. And that's just a weakness of the CDI. So the CDI is just one tool here that can capture large-scale trends in the data, sometimes at the expense of these smaller scale semantic variation bits that we're interested in.
Yeah, that's interesting. Anybody else? Thea. Right, so can you see Thea's question in the chat? In the study which identified concreteness as a key predictor of development, was the sample of words learned based on CDIs or Childis database? Sorry, I missed it, she said.
Hi, Thea. So we were talking about this study where we saw that frequency and concreteness were strong predictors. So this is a study which uses the approach of linking average input for each of these languages from Childis to outcomes in Wordbank. So the idea is you take the time when dog or jump is learned, and you put that into a regression. And the predictor is the concreteness of each of these words. So dog being more concrete than jump, but also maybe dog being more frequent than jump, having one fewer, one fewer phone, so forth. So this is it's a kind of multivariate regression approach that links average input to average outcomes.
Do you want to follow that up there or not?
Yeah, sorry, it's really noisy at home, so that's why I was putting it in the chat, but I'll try and see if I can talk it through. So the outcome measures are based on the CDIs, is that right? Have I got that right? Yeah. So the reason I ask is that the CDI, most of the words on there in terms of nouns in particular, are pretty much almost all concrete, aren't they?
I would say they vary in their concreteness. It is certainly true that more of those nouns are concrete, but tomorrow is not so concrete.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find I'm very interested in concreteness and abstractness at the minute in word learning, and so I was really interested in that. So I was just trying to kind of get my head around the extent to which you get that gradability in the CDI data in terms of the nouns. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, syntactic categories, as many of you know, are a bit of an abstraction that we put on words. And so we, delineating, okay, are these exactly nouns in the CDI is sometimes a bit of a black art. But I'll just show you, this gives me an example to show off Wordbank, right? So this is the Wordbank item trajectories. We could add after airplane, animal is a little more abstract, perhaps. Backyard, I don't know, place words, right? There's a bunch of variation here. It certainly skews concrete, no question of that, but there's plenty of other materials. It's a lot of words in the end. So for each of these, if you're interested in the kind of broader data set, welcome to take a look. There we have the concreteness values along with the acquisition ages stored for these.
Anyone?
Brilliant, thank you so much. And if I can just say thanks so much for all this wonderful work that you've done. That was the first place I went looking for abstract words.
Oh, great, excellent.
Anyone else? Okay, well, I'll follow that up, Michael, by one of the things I worry about all the time, which is cross-linguistic, particularly cultural differences. So let's take one example of rural versus urban. So there's a suggestion that in non-weird cultures, so that is rural cultures in which people live in more traditional societies, something like kinship terms are very important, and they're learnt much earlier than nouns in the traditional sense of nouns of the CDI. Presumably it's going to be difficult to reflect that in your in these studies because you don't have enough of the ethnographic data to really be able to interrogate a question like that. Am I right in that?
Yes, generally. I mean, so we do have, thanks to Katie Alcock's really nice work, the Kiswahili and Kigiriama data. So that's very good, but it's true that overall we have far fewer data points and languages from small scale or traditional societies. And that is a critical issue in making very large generalizations here. But you're pointing out a really very interesting research question, which is to ask about the dimensions of variation along kind of the semantic gradient, which things are over and underrepresented. So again, to kind of pitch these open resources, let me just share screen and show you. This is a Wordbank book This is our chapter on vocabulary composition for semantic categories. And here, so what you do here is you plot the number of words from a particular semantic category, like sounds or body parts or games and routines, and then you fit a curve to it. So this is overall vocabulary size on the X and proportion of the category on the Y. And what you see is, for example, sounds or body parts or games and routines, the curve bends up, meaning those words are overrepresented in early vocabulary. Time words, places, the curve bends down. So here are the curves for all of the languages that we had in this study. Sounds, they all bend up, except for one kind of wacky data set. Time words, they all bend down. But there is some variation. You know, just interestingly, places are kind of largely bent down. Clothing, though, is kind of heterogeneous. Vehicles are heterogeneous, and so forth. So, you know, there's lots of fun you can have with these data. We only kind of scratched the surface, you know, but you can, for example, look at different principal components in sort of semantic bias space.
Fascinating.
So you get kind of a people versus people and places versus vehicles dimension, and you can actually project languages in here. And you do see that Kigiriama and Kiswahili are kind of in their own section.
Yep, great.
In the space, you get some kind of clustering. Mandarin and Cantonese are kind of over here in the people places as opposed to the vehicles. You get a bunch of the Germanic languages over here in kind of the vehicle chunk and so forth.
Right, okay.
So yeah, it's a fun game to play, and where we are really limited by the typological diversity and environmental diversity of the languages. But to the extent that we get more of such data, we can continue to explore this issue.
Great, thanks. So Suzanne Arsens has a question that she's going to ask for herself over her mic. No, we can't hear you, Suzanne.
Elena, I actually have a follow-up to your question.
Who's speaking to me now? Suzanne.
Katie.
Katie, hang on. We've got Suzanne
Yep.
first. You need to unmute somehow, Suzanne. Maybe I can do it.
Suzanne said I should go ahead. I think she might be having problems.
All right, Katie, off you go.
Sorry, I was just going to say that it kind of depends for the question that you had. It kind of depends whether you're interested in maybe the first 10 words or the first 50 words, because within the first 10 words, the data from Swahili and Kigiriama were very much the same people words that English speaking or European kids know, plus some animal sounds, which is the same kind of pattern as Northern European kids. They like animal sounds and they like mummy and daddy. And then when you get beyond that, it seemed to be more diverse and more more dissimilar to the kind of well-known Northern European pattern. And it was in that category that there started to be a lot of the next 50 words or so in spoken language. So it's whether you're talking about the really small ones with their very, very first words, or the ones who know a few more words. And the other thing to bear in mind is that in some of these languages, there simply are more people words. There are more words for relationships. So you have a word for different kinds of uncles and aunts. So you simply can know more vocabulary categories. So hopefully Mike and I are in discussion about getting some collaboration funding to work more on this. And now we have, I think we're now up to 8 or 9 Southern African languages. And we have quite a bit of data in some of them, although some are very preliminary. So we should be able to answer that a bit more after we have a bit more of that data.
That sounds great. Suzanne, either try unmuting again, or why don't you put your question in the chat? Okay.
Yep, got it. Great. So Suzanne writes, thanks for your talk. Well, thank you. My question is about baby view. It reminded me of the lab-based experiments by Linda Smith, Chen Yu, and colleagues about what's in view for toddlers. Do you think that you can replicate their findings with your data? For example, that infants learn words for objects that are in view, and that caregivers naturally label objects when they are the main thing in view for infants. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your future plans for baby view data in general. Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. You're absolutely right. As I hope I mentioned, that Linda Smith and Chen Yu's work is really a prime inspiration for doing this. Our goal is to create data sets that are broadly available to the community because of the privacy restrictions. That's been one complex thing about egocentric data, is that if the privacy protections aren't dealt with very early on in a very systematic and careful way, then provision isn't made for data sharing, then you can't kind of grandfather that in later. So the goal for BabyView, first and foremost, is to create an openly available large data set so that we can look at these questions outside of any individual lab, which has not been possible at the moment. I suspect that we will be able to replicate many of those findings, but I think it'll be interesting, because some work comparing videotaped interactions with, for example, Lena data, which are day-long audio recordings, finds that some of the practices that you see in the videotapes are pretty different than those that you observe more passively in Lena. The density of language is different. The kind of nature of the referential language is different, suggesting that there is a bit of like, okay, well, there's a canonical way that we play in a videotaped play session with particular instructions, at least for certain kind of subcultures of parents, and that we might not always see that many moments of that in natural interaction. So, I do think probably, I believe those findings. I think that they're certainly robust in the contexts of study, and it's an open question how general they are. And it's going to take a bunch of either human annotation or machine learning to really test that at scale. More generally, our plans for the BabyView data are to think about the application of some descriptive models from computer vision. So we've done a bunch of work recently. This is Bria Long's wonderful work, training computer vision models and applying them to try to understand how children's social interactions change over developmental time. And so we're hoping to map out that trajectory with more detail and look at its relationship, the kind of access to eyes and faces and hands, look at that relationship to language data. And I should say, we're also just going to use these big AI models to try to learn representations from them, like following this work by Dan Yeamans and Chung Shu.
Right, anyone else? Vera Kemp has a question, I think also in the chat. Let me have a look. Yeah.
Hi, Vera. Vera asks, is there any merit in possibly of expanding Wordbank beyond age 3 to chart vocabulary growth into adolescence? Yeah, so the measurement of vocabulary further into the lifespan is of huge importance, right? Because direct measures of vocabulary like the PPVT and its equivalents, or NIH Toolbox, the many different measures that are out there are pretty strong predictors of, for example, reading success. They correlate widely with a variety of other academic achievement measures. They're useful psychometrically. Parent report is not as widely used for older kids. There is a kind of fun example where somebody, Melissa Libertas, actually took the PPVT word list and just asked parents to report on those words for older kids, and it wasn't terrible. But in general, parent report is not preferable compared to direct assessment for older kids. So yeah, there are a lot of these direct assessments for older kids, and with few exceptions, they are closed, meaning you have to buy them or install some piece of software and then administer them via that platform. That includes the US government-funded NIH Toolbox, which doesn't have a publicly available list of items for their administration. It includes the PPVT, for which the normative data are not available, and so forth. I think this is quite frustrating, and I think others agree. So you really can't do these kinds of data analyses on, to my knowledge, extant data sets on older kids. A number of groups are working to remedy this issue. So Manuel Bahn, who's a former postdoc from my lab, now at the MPI in Leipzig, just released a German language psychometrically constructed tool for vocabulary assessment in, I don't know, 3 to 7 year old kids. Looks pretty neat. And we're working on a much larger scale direct vocabulary assessment with the aim of testing kids 2 to 8 or so. That's kind of in the works. So we certainly have our eyes on this same issue. And I would love to probe whether there's continuity between the trends we see in early development and later language learning, during kind of middle grade, school age kids.
Okay, that's great. I think Gert has his electronic hand up. Gert, you're next.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for this really fascinating talk, Mike. My question is about the learning mechanisms. So how sophisticated you think they have to be? Because basically you had predictors and then you regress them on outcomes. Is there anything more to learning than that? What do you think?
Well, multiple regression is a very convenient way for putting together predictors that come from very different places. Some of those predictors, even in some of the studies I showed you, are derived from what you might call more sophisticated mechanisms. So I do not think an LSTM is the right model for kind of predictive language processes, but it's not a bad language model in some ways. It's not a bad approximation. It was better than n-gram models as an approximation of predictability in language. And the multiple regression framework allows us to stick that into the mix along with concreteness, which the LSTM knows nothing about. Now, what you'd love to see is a model that could capture multiple information sources and replace several predictors, not just one in the framework. Maybe the ultimate goal would be to replace all of them. So if you had a multimodal data set and you had some predictors of language learning based on the kind of visual concept learning, visual exposure, and the sort of multimodal matches that were possible, the referential matches that were possible, maybe that would knock out both concreteness and predictability. That would be cool, or concreteness and frequency. And so you could really use this framework as a way of doing model comparison. So I think there are real weaknesses where, especially to this, we call it the mega child approach, where we just average all the input and average all the uptake. That's not ideal by any means. It's a way of getting around the fact that dense data about input and uptake rarely co-occur. But I think the overall predictive framework is flexible enough to accommodate much more model-based predictors, and that's the direction that we've been going in.
Can I just quickly follow this up by asking, so the predictors that you use, they're basically unique to the word itself or to the environment, the relation to other words in the environment, but there's also data to show that infants or toddlers seem to be better at learning words that are, say, for example, semantically related to words they already know. So do you think this is that a separate predictor? So kind of an iterative model that takes itself into account? Or would you say that's something that falls out of the other external predictors?
Yeah, and so, okay, in the literature on network growth, there are two different models that get contrasted, and this is we look at this in that Fortasi study, the network study I showed. I can never remember. I love Thomas Hill's work on this, but I can never remember the labels he used, so I'm going to use our labels. There's internal growth mechanisms. That's where you look at the network and something that's kind of well connected in the network gets more words attached to it. And thanks, Katie. And then there's external growth, which says, okay, I've got my network, and something that's well connected in the external network, the adult network, is going to get added soon, even if it's not well connected in the child's own network. That internal growth mechanism is closer to the kind of small world structure that gets described in much network growth literature. The external growth is not. In Hill's work, they find that the external growth is likely the predictor, and we replicate that across 10 languages. We actually spend a lot of time implementing the internal growth model, which that iterative predictor requires a lot more sophistication in the regression framework, as I think you're alluding to, because you need to use the network at time t to produce the predictor for time t+1. So we spent a lot of time doing that. And I say we, I really mean Abdullah. Abdullah did all of this work and did a wonderful job at it. And we replicated Hill's finding that the external structure was more predictive, even with our control set and the broader set of languages. So one interpretation and one caveat. The interpretation of that I took to be that, that to me smelled like statistical learning, because how can the child know what the adult's network looks like? They can't. What they can see is the statistical traces of that network in the co-occurrence of words and co-occurrence of objects in the environment and so forth. A caveat to this finding, though, is that neither we nor Hills know the internal networks of, well, no, so that's not true. We have enough data to test this, but we don't have that kind of longitudinal data that will really be required to make the strongest test of the internal hypothesis. I'm caveating because we actually now do have some Norwegian and a little bit of English, good longitudinal data. So maybe we should go back and retest the internal growth model. It was robustly defeated in every simulation. So we never found any support for it. So we didn't chase it down as hard as maybe we should have. But we could go back, or somebody, maybe somebody enterprising on this call could go back and test internal growth with the longitudinal data. I think maybe Hills, though, did actually in he had several nice papers on them. It was really a wonderful group of papers where he worked this out. And I think he did test it on the longitudinal data and did not find support, but correct me if you remember better.
Really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Anyone else? If there isn't anyone, can I just follow that up a bit? So by I think I know what external growth means. It means the input and statistical. What's the psychological correlate of internal growth?
Oh, it's like I'm an expert on bathrooms and I know the word sink, and I know the word tub, and I know the word ducky, and so now I'm going to learn the word soap because of that expertise.
Okay.
So like it's the idea that the kind of semantic network that I have is integral to learning a new word in that context.
I thought it might mean that. Then I wondered whether there might be developmental changes in that, so that early on you might be pushed by, what you're hearing and by the external growth, but later on, as you develop your own little obsessions, internal growth might become more important. So I wondered if that might be something you could also look for, or whether you had.
We haven't. It's a fascinating idea. Certainly true. There's the wonderful. Well, it's true for anybody who has had a kid that they see these obsessions. But there's the wonderful work by Judy Deloche on kind of these like little obsessive islands in children's vocabulary. One question I would have, and this is a broader discussion and a broader kind of limitation of our work, is about causal inference there. It might be that, when you know the words, Pontiac and Ford and Fiat and Volvo and so forth, that helps you learn new car terms, or it might be that there's an unobserved interest in cars that drives the whole thing, and it's not an internal growth of the vocabulary at all. It's just that there's an external driver that's not network structure. So that causal inference worry is present behind the scenes of many of these different inferences, but it just feels like it especially is salient here.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I'm looking for hands or for anybody who wants to. Thing is, I've got a million questions I want to ask, but I don't want to take up all your time. Is there anyone else who has now got a burning question? I can't see anyone. So maybe I could ask you, when I first started out, which is a very long time ago, I worked on individual differences in acquisition between 3 little girls. And one was a word builder and one was a phrase collector. And I was fascinated by what you said about individual differences, but I couldn't quite work out how you were assessing that. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about how you did that, and whether it had anything to do with my word builders versus phrase acquirers.
Yes, yeah, it really does. So this is a kind of another deep dive into the Wordbank data. So and actually, I'm going to forget all of the references in this kind of discussion and debate, but I think that there are kind of a number of contributions here. So there's a complex and nonlinear trajectory that kids take on average through vocabulary space. So their vocabulary gets bigger. We know that. And they also, on average, tend to learn nouns earlier, or object words, however you kind of class this category, earlier. So, this is a kind of a general plot here. of the proportion of nouns by age. So that's kind of the general trajectory.
Mhm.
So in order to find out if a child's vocabulary is nouny, you can't just look at whether they have a lot of nouns in their vocabulary, because on average, a younger child and a child with a smaller vocabulary would have more nouns. So what we did was we removed those signals. We regressed out that nonlinear progression through kind of nouniness, and said, for age and vocabulary size, does this child have a relatively more referential nouny style or not? So you get this kind of age, this growth corrected vocabulary composition. And when you take that out, that growth corrected vocabulary composition then predicts syntactic complexity.
Right.
So, and the coefficient is negative across these languages. It's not perfect. There's some variation in the data. This is a kind of an odd data set for a variety of reasons. But overall, the trend is that if you tend to have more nouns per, than we'd expect for your age and for your vocabulary size, you will also tend to be combining words less.
Right. That's interesting.
So we took that to support the old, Catherine Nelson idea of referential versus expressive, which is, I think, the one that you've used in your work as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what the precedence claim is there, but I think the general complex of word builders, or phrase builders, referential, expressive, that general set of ideas was strongly supported in these data.
That's very interesting.
Let me show you one more data point because I can't resist. That is for the relations between vocabulary, grammar, and the lexicon. So this is the kind of classic Bates picture that your productive vocabulary relates very strongly to your complexity score, the complexity of your syntax across all of these languages. It's, she was just right about that, which is just amazing to me. I mean, really strong data. But there is also a second order signal here, which is that this is the production one. The older you are, the more kind of units grammar per unit vocabulary you get on average. And to me, this again smells a little bit like generalization. It's, your stronger working memory, your better learning abilities seem like they might then drive you to learn more grammar from the words you know as an older kid. It's just a correlational pattern. There's lots of other explanations.